Climate change, it's a relationship problem. I gave this talk at the Climate House, for the new Climate House in Oslo last month. And when I arrived in the morning, it was a breakfast seminar, and when I arrived, it was all women. And I thought that this title might not actually be like the perfect title. But what I want to emphasize is that we might be framing climate change in the wrong way and addressing the wrong problem when we frame it just as an environmental issue. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I do on transformations to sustainability, and really kind of putting it in the context of, how do we really, if we take the science of climate change seriously, what do we do now to meet the challenges? The three questions that drive my research these days are these. How do we transform at the scope, the scale, the speed, and the depth that is called for by climate science? And this is not a question of can we transform, but it's really how do we do this? And how do we transform in an equitable, ethical, and sustainable manner? Because certainly there are many different ways you could get transformations to happen, and not all of them will be successful, and many of them will be very oppressive. So it's not a neutral kind of change we're talking about. But I'm also interested then more theoretically and practically is what is that relationship between individual change, collective change, and systems change? Because I think that at the end of the day, when we start to talk about an issue like climate change, many people just kind of go like, oh my God, do I actually matter? Can I make a difference in, with such a huge, hyper complex problem? And this, I think, becomes then, the question for the century is how do we, each and every one of us, engage with the type of transformations that are needed? Just to go back to where I started, when I was a master's student, I started in 1988, which was like the really hot summer in the United States when James Hansen testified for a congressional committee that climate change is real. And if you look at the newspaper from back then, you'll see that many of the same issues are in the news today. There it was like global warming has begun, but you see in issues of migration, food insecurity, et cetera, et cetera. And in those more than 30 years since I started, we've really seen, CO2 emissions have gone up steadily and steadily and steadily. So whereas they were below 350 parts per meter in the late 1980s, right now, it's not even on this graph, but it's about 408 parts per meter per million. So the impacts that we're having, we haven't actually slowed warming much. So what do we do? How do we approach this? And over the last years, I've really focused a lot on trying to understand what are the social and human dimensions of climate change? What does it mean for human security? What are the relationships with globalization and development? How do we start to really think about what climate change means for society? And probably about 10 years ago, if you look at some of the books I published, you start thinking about, in the subtitles, transformations comes up. Because if we actually understand both the potential for adaptation, but also the limits of climate change adaptation, you start to see that the biggest and most important change we can do really is to deliberately transform towards a sustainable, thriving, equitable world. And so, just to really start to focus a little bit more on the change part of climate change has meant that I had to really open up to a different literature and different approaches, and I'll talk about that later. But where I want to start is the question we ask really in this book on climate and society that I wrote with Robin Lyschenko. And we wrote this book because we both teach very similar courses. She's at Rutgers University, and I'm teaching undergraduate environment and society course. And often when we talk about climate change, you get people who really are, it's an environmental problem. We deal with it in environmental ministries. We try to find environmental policies. We really start to look at it as a CO2 problem or, problems about emissions, problems about, technical adaptations, et cetera. And what we try to say is this is actually a social problem. This is a human problem. This is a human security problem. This is a development problem. This is about the way we have organized society, organized our economies, organized the way, it's about the way we see ourselves in the world and our relationship with the world. So it's about our relationship with ourselves, with each other, with other species, and not the least with the future. So, how do we relate to time? So that's why I titled this talk, Climate Change, It's a Relationship Problem, because once we get to if we address it at its deepest roots of how we see ourselves in the world, we start to address not just climate change, but biodiversity loss and inequality and conflicts, et cetera, et cetera. And what's really important, and one of the points that we make over and over again in the book, is that the way we actually look at the world, the way we frame the issue of climate change has important implications for how we identify the solutions. And I can't emphasize that more, because if we start to see climate change just as this technical problem, we're only going to look for technical solutions, and some of those may actually have, impacts that we have know nothing about, such as geoengineering. So identifying different ways of talking about climate change and different lenses for looking at climate change. You can see it like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as an environmental problem, and there's certainly a truth to that. Continued emissions of greenhouse gases will cause further warming and changes in all components of the climate system. Limiting climate change will require substantial and sustained reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. Absolutely true. But this biophysical discourse really limits the problem to these things that we can deal with through institutions. We can deal with them in ways, with international negotiations, with better management, with new technologies, it starts to really narrow down that focus to let's deal with climate change, environmental. And that creates a polarization, because you start to think of that, the environmentalists care about this. And you start to think that the answers have to come from international negotiations and from, it doesn't actually involve the types of social changes. If we start to see climate change from a social perspective, as a social problem, a political problem, an economic problem, a cultural problem, we start to widen that solution space and see that, actually there's much more that needs to change. Just to cite from Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, where she focuses on capitalism versus the climate, she says that the three policy pillars of the neoliberal age, privatization of the public sphere, deregulation of the corporate sector, and the lowering of income and corporate taxes paid for with cuts to public spending, are each incompatible with many of the actions we must take to bring our emissions to safe levels. So she's looking at a very different problem space than the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So within this critical social discourse on climate change and environmental change, you start to question the very way that we organize society, the systems, the structures, the issue of power and interests, and the dynamics that have existed over time. And so colonization and oppression of women and othering, all of these things become part of that solution to environmental change. And again, so this is it's important to look at this as well. But we can't forget that there are many people that dismiss climate change as an issue, still in 2019. And when we look at the dismissive discourse on climate change, it's not just about those people who deny that climate change is an issue in the first place. Because first of all, there's people who are dismissing the science. They're saying that, there's no evidence of climate. This is all just natural variability, and there is no evidence that the climate is changing in any way other than what might have happened, all through history. We can look at the Pleistocene Eocene thermal maximum, PETM, 50 million years ago, and or Pliocene, and say the temperatures were 5 degrees warmer back then. When you look at it, that was over 20,000 years, not over 100 years or 150 years or so. So the logic in that can very much be questioned. And often the people who are dismissing the science are also not looking at systemic patterns of change. Picking out this glacier is actually growing and it got cooler in this part of the world, rather than Earth system scientists who are trying to see how these patterns are interacting and interrelated. There are some people who dismiss climate change because, as a human, they'll say the climate is changing, but it's certainly not people. We're too small to make a difference. We're just, that we weren't even here 50 million years ago. How could we have made an impact then when it changed? And to dismiss the human causes is to really say, oh, it's the sunspots, it's the Milankovitch cycles, it's anything but us that are responsible for those, for the climate. But the climate is changing, so we might need to adapt or whatever. And that whatever, many people are just saying like, well, humans were never, they were destined for extinction as well. But we get into also like people that are dismiss, they might recognize climate change as an issue, but really dismiss the significance of it. And we're seeing less of that now. But a few years ago, you could talk to anyone. I guess climate change is an issue, but poverty is a really big issue. And so is, terrorism, so is drug addiction. So, kind of stacking the issues as if some are more important. And what we're trying to say is that when you start to look at climate change as a relationship problem, as a social issue, you start to see that they're all interrelated with how we relate to each other, like how, how do you relate to each other and the future? So, and perhaps, of biggest concern is, and this is what I think got Greta Thunberg concerned and upset, is that many people acknowledge climate change without really doing anything to address it. And they feel very disempowered, very unable, like just don't even talk about it. And if I, as I mentioned, I tend to talk about climate change a lot, and it's not fun to invite someone like me to a party and then let's talk about the weather. I'm like, no, let's talk about the climate. And they're like, oh, here she goes again. And, but there's a very, there's this tendency for us to just go like, I just don't want to talk about it. I don't want to deal with it. I don't, it's too big for me. It's too, it's like it's too uncomfortable. It's not happening. And that's where we see that, young people are saying, wait a minute, we've got to face this. We've got to start to look at this. So Robin and I, in this book, are really trying to present an integrative approach to climate change. And by integrative, I mean, that recognizes the validity of these different perspectives, that people are taking them, they're not coming out of the blue, they're for a reason, and that we have to be able to pull in, like, people's experiences of climate change or why they might relate to it or not relate to it. We need to bring in this collective, this we, our cultural dimensions of this. How are we relating to this culturally as a society? What is threatened by climate change? And then emphasizing the connections with other large-scale processes of change, including globalization processes. And Robin, who is an economic geographer, we were in graduate school together, and in the late 1990s, we started working together on this idea of double exposure, that globalization and climate change are both creating winners and losers. They're not random, but it's really like there's a context, there are feedbacks, and there really are, like the outcomes are very much predictable. The ones who are most marginalized often tend to be resulting from climate change. And we did studies in India and in different parts, really looking at how both processes are affecting people. You can't separate them, and people are responding to change in general rather than just to climate change. And so when you start to try to make sense of these different ways of the different perspectives on climate change and the different ways that things are playing out in society today or in the 21st century, we start to see that you really have to look at the individual and shared beliefs, values, and worldviews, and how they have developed over time, how they are playing out right now in terms of whose values count when we're starting to think about that future. What beliefs are guiding our responses, and this is if we believe that we are too small or too stupid or too doomed to do anything, that's going to create a very different future than if we believe that, wow, collectively we actually can change. So to bring in those deeper human dimensions, I think is really important, and that's been the research that I talk about, really tries to bring, to connect that, like, what's out there with what's in here, and really starting to get people to shift their perspective on climate change. So an integrative approach really opens the door for new types of inquiry and new ways of relating to both climate change, as a problem, but also the solution. So in general, we're trying to broaden and deepen the solution space for climate change. So going away from just reducing everything to just greenhouse gas emissions and your carbon footprint, to actually seeing this bigger picture, saying like, wow, this is about equity, this is about justice, this is the way we organize our cities, the way we deal with, address other species, see other species, etc. So it's important, again, because how we define a problem influences the type of solutions that are both identified and prioritized. So they say that if you have a hammer, everything you see is a nail. You're like, I'm going to do that. And this is where, if you see it just as an environmental problem where technologies and managerial solutions and behavioral solutions can happen, that's all we'll be really focusing on. And we'll miss that wider chance to really start to deal with the deeper dimensions of it. And it's also important because, for me, one of my concerns is that many people who have been very dismissive of climate change are suddenly feeling it and getting quite alarmed. And they're jumping from being like kind of, dismissive about climate change for one reason or another to saying, oh, we need geoengineering. We need to actually do everything we can right now to stop this problem by putting aerosols in the atmosphere or, sulfates in the oceans or whatever. And I think that, again, that can be very dangerous. It's dangerous to solve the problem with the same paradigm that that caused the problem in the first place. So rather than just seeing climate change as this environmental CO2 problem that we have to handle, which of course it is, there's no doubt about that, if we start to look at climate change as a relationship problem, we'll really start to see many different ways of approaching it. And I think everybody, you don't have to be an environmentalist to address this, but what I want to talk about is how transformations come about and how do we actually activate that change. But before I get into that, I just want to get into what's at stake here, because I think sometimes it's very easy to just say oh, climate change, yes, we will deal with that eventually, and to really get it under our skins, to take the science really seriously. That wow, this is really happening. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I think this statement just kind of gives this idea that human influence on the climate system is clear, and this is evident from increasing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, positive radiative forcing, observed warming, and understanding of the climate system. And that last part is really important because it's how we understand the system. It's not whether you believe in climate change or not, but it's, do we understand that we are part of the climate system? And that's the whole idea of the Anthropocene, that we are actually having impacts on the Earth system, creating that new geology. So this idea is really important, and yet, we haven't actually mobilized ourselves collectively to take this seriously and to wow, what does this actually mean? If we can transform systems like the climate systems, if we are part of that, then how do we organize ourselves to create a world, a thriving world, for example? And the IPCC also emphasizes, and this was in the synthesis report that I was part of in 2014, that the future is a choice. And what it's saying here is that, with substantial mitigation, we will have a world that is 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius warmer. And you can see, that looks like the bright picture, but, even a half a degree is too much warming for many groups, many species, many communities. And so there will be a lot of adaptation, there will be a lot of losses even now. And we were talking before the class that, this is already being experienced with wildfires in many parts of the world right now in California, with droughts, with floods, with hurricanes, there's so many changes that are going on right now that for us to pretend that climate change is going to happen in 2030, 2050, 2100 is really missing the point of climate change as a process. Climate change is something that we are contributing. But when we look at that map on the right, which is without additional mitigation, we start to see a world that is so different from anything we can actually imagine right now. And having worked on climate change adaptation, we start to say, we don't actually have a science of adaptation. We don't know how to adapt to that. And I'll just give you some examples in a minute. But it really is a, terra incognita, like a non-analog world for us. And the statement that I that sits with me from the IPCC report, the summary for policymakers and the synthesis report, is that without additional mitigation efforts beyond those in place today, and even with adaptation, warming by the end of the 21st century will lead to high to very high risk of severe, widespread, and irreversible impacts globally. And we say that with high confidence. And the little baby that was here earlier, that people, generations here today will be alive in 2100, so it's really it's not about the future, but it's really about, what do we do now to actually influence that past? And I want to just show you, to try to put this into perspective, I'm going to just show you this animation from 1884 to about 2011 that shows the warming that has happened based on just the average over this period, with the cooler temperatures are in the blues, and the warmer temperatures are in the yellows and the oranges. And you can see the distribution and how they change over time from the average over this one period of time. And right here, for example, in 1884, West Africa was very warm, southern United States and Mexico and Australia, but other parts were relatively cool. So watch as I go through this, or we go through this. And you can see the changes, and when we get to the 1930s, the Dust Bowl in the United States, you can see that it was warm in the United States, but cooler in many other parts in the world. And you can see that the last decades then have become warmer and warmer and warmer relative to that whole period. And I think that's really impactful. And what I want to do now is just show it to you again. And I want you, because we're talking about relationship problems, I want you to think of the year you were born, the year your mother was born, and the year your grandmother was born, okay? And then just look at the graph and just start to think about the realities that they lived in. So I was born in 1963, my mother in 1939, and my grandmother in 1907. So I will look at those years and just look at where they were and what context, because what I want to get across is that we're really transforming the entire context in which we're looking at both the problem and the solutions as we go here. Does everyone have the dates in their head? They could use mother or father and guess on your grandparents. So. And my grandmother and my mother were in Germany, so that's where I'm going to focus. And you can see that those changes, how they happened. I was also born in Germany, that suddenly the last decades have really been quite different. So somebody growing up today really hasn't had an experience of what might have been considered like the normal climate years ago. And when we start to look at, that went up to 2011, and when we start to look at the hottest years on record globally, we see that the last 5 have been the hottest. And you see that most people, from my children, I have 2 sons born in 1995 and 1998, and a daughter in 2001, and you can see that their experience has been warmer and warmer and warmer and warmer in the hottest years on record. So this is kind of like that we've already seen an average temperature increase of 1 degree Celsius globally, and it's been more in some parts of the world and less in other parts of the world. So to really take that in, that wow, we're actually, we're already in this, and the indicators of warming are around us in so many different ways. The temperature over land, humidity, air temperature near the surface, tree lines shifting, spring coming earlier, species migrating poleward and upward. And what's interesting is, important too, is like sea ice and ice sheets and how they're changing. And I know that there's a lot of research going on at the university about those issues here. But when we start to look at how sea ice has changed, like for example here between 1984 and 2012, you start to see dramatic changes that are actually having huge implications all over the world. And this is the 2012, and this is the 1984. And if you can think in terms of globalization, in terms of like the implications of this, what might be some of the impacts of this melting of sea ice for development? Like what are the consequences of less sea ice? Does anyone have any suggestions? There's a hand over there? Yeah?
There's a lot of talk about the northeast and northwest passages for shipping routes.
Right. The northeast, he said that there's a lot of impact on the northeast and northwest passages for shipping. So suddenly, instead of going down by the Suez Canal, you can actually have ships going across the Arctic. Yeah?
Kind of the other side of the coin. People see opportunity and not a problem.
Yeah, many people see that as a great opportunity because suddenly it costs less to ship goods from one part of the world to another part of the world, and it's also opening up for lots of tourism. So they're building more and more cruise ships for what some people refer to as last chance tourism. What else does it open up for? Does anyone have any? Yeah.
New oil fields might not become available.
Mm-hmm. He says new oil fields are becoming available. There's oil, gas, minerals. There's lots of resources in the Arctic that are suddenly becoming available. So whereas maybe we're framing this as, oh my gosh, the Arctic is, Arctic sea ice is thinning and melting, other people are seeing this as a great opportunity for further development. And that's where what we call feedback double exposure comes in, is that you're changing the albedo, the reflectivity of the surface in the Arctic, but you're also creating economic and social cultural feedbacks. It's affecting people's ways of life, it's affecting biodiversity, etc. We also see exceptionally early ice melt in Greenland, which is creating a lot of concerns. This is just the difference between June in 2014 and June in 2016, just to show you some of the differences. Again, that like we're seeing patterns and changes in so many parts of the world that are actually alarming in terms of science, what scientists are thinking. And if, for example, the more that the Greenland ice sheet melts and the faster that it melts, it actually has big implications for sea level rise. And this is concerning to scientists who are saying that Greenland's melting ice nears a tipping point, that it's melting faster than has been modeled before. And again, these kind of ideas that there are tipping points in the Earth system where you get irreversible impacts or responses, whether it's related to the ocean currents or to Antarctic ice sheets or to the Amazon forest, or methane or whatever. But this idea of melting ice sheets is really important because also, again, people look at it in different ways. And I read in the New York Times a few years ago that a mining executive from Greenland said, I don't care if the whole Greenland ice sheet melts, it will reveal some really interesting geology. In other words, gold. So there's a lot of people looking for resources, including the President of the United States. Oh, they're, who cares about? And what we know is that it actually has enormous consequences. And just this week in the a scientific paper was published showing that we're really underestimating the impacts of sea level rise on cities, that it actually will affect 3 times as many people. It says that, like by 2050, much more than previously thought. And that this is really, the large area, like we're really underestimating the role of tides. And just, they give some beautiful examples of maps, and this is just southern Vietnam, and you can see that 2050 isn't very far away. And so the impacts of this, and they're talking about what are the implications for population displacement. Right now we do a very poor job of dealing with people who are displaced from their homes for many reasons, including climate and extremes, et cetera. So what does this actually mean for us as we have to respond? So this is just, just to say that, the changes are underway, and climate change will transform society. But if we say the future is a choice, then what future are we actually choosing? And as someone interested in the social and human dimensions, we look at what climate change means for food security. What does it mean for biodiversity and ecosystem services, or for water availability, for small islands and coastal communities, for droughts, for coffee farmers. Like if half the world's supply of coffee disappears, I study coffee, I don't drink it, but I know that many people would be very shaky without it. But water is it's just the essential. So not just the quantity, but the quality of water. So there's all of these different dimensions that will be affected by climate change, and we've got to start to think what do we actually do about them? And many people say it's like, oh, we just adapt to these changes, you know, and there's a lot of work. In the 1990s, people wouldn't talk about adaptation because it was like, no, because then you won't put attention on mitigation. But adaptation solutions for climate change, you can see from this figure, you know, it's from engineered, you know, the built environment solutions, institutional solutions, technological solutions, and ecosystem-based solutions. So we have lots of ways to deal with that 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree, 4 degree warmer world, but we also know that there are barriers to adaptation in terms of the cost, and that article, the new study on sea level rise just shows that, you know, like we have the costs of dealing with that and the technologies and things, just it's more about dealing with the losses. But what you see here is like adaptation is really the process of adjustment to actual or expected changes in the climate. And when I start to study, when I start to think about adaptation and recognizing that there are limits to adaptation, I'm as much interested in, you know, like maybe it's not just adapting to the impacts of climate change, maybe it's adapting to the very idea that we can transform systems. So the adaptation is as much like in our head to recognize collectively that, wow, this is something that, you know, we can actually do something about. So how do we actually, you know, collectively respond to what many perceive to be an existential threat? And I think that that's where, you know, when we start to look at those social tipping points and you know, the tipping points in relation to social tipping points, we have to start to question our whole understanding of social change and how it comes about. And I want to kind of talk more about that. But just to put it again in that context, that we have many different scenarios for the future, you know, going up to 5.4 degrees, or, you know, to the lowest one, RCP, Representative Concentration Pathway 2.6, which is the one that is consistent with a 1.5 degree warmer world, or 2.3, you know, warmer world. So the pledges for the Paris Agreement really are putting us on that, like a little bit above 3 degree warmer world, which is, you know, in those maps, it's much closer to that world on the right-hand side. And again, the difference between, you know, 1.5 degree, 2 degree, 2.5, 3, it's not a linear difference. It's a, you know, it's an enormous difference that it's very hard for us to even comprehend or visualize what that actually means for society. And when the scientists, the IPCC scientists were putting up the first like curves on these, I was just so happy to see like the blue curves. Like, oh, there's scenarios that actually are good. Like, oh, no, those are highly improbable. And that idea then that, you know, how do you actually make these radical cuts? And scientists are saying that we need to do this, and policymakers, in, you know, the next 10 to 12 years. How many of you think it's possible to actually bend the curves on climate change? Okay. Okay, Hilda says it's possible. The IPCC says it's actually possible, that we actually have the technologies. We actually could do it. So in terms of potentiality, it's there. In terms of probability, you know, I think most people go like, oh gosh, you know, our emissions are even going up faster. So that's, you know, there's that disconnect between, and that kind of makes people just think like, oh, you know, when we say it has to be done by 2020, 2021. And in teaching, I always had like 2010, we are in the decade that matters, and we need to shift the curves by 2012. And then 2012, we're in the decade that matters, we need to shift by 2014, and, you know, just kind of keep going, and that creep, and you never, it's like, it's this idea that we keep pushing it into the future and never getting there, that like sustainability is there, rather than saying like, wow, this is really like the 2030 agenda should be the 2019 agenda, and we really need to start to, you know, like that, like be working to bend the curves right here and right now, not in the next 10 years or whatever. So how do we actually do that? And that is then where, again, just to mention a little bit about my research on adaptation. You know, there is no doubt that we have to adapt to impacts of climate change. We are poorly adapted now in many situations. California is facing not just fires, but you know, like loss of power and electricity just to avoid, you know, it's catastrophe, catastrophe, catastrophe in many parts of the world. So how do we actually adapt to that? So my research is called Adaptation Connects, and it's really trying to make those connections between, you know, like, how do we deal with this in a relational way? How do we make the connection so that we can see ourselves not just as the problem, but as the solutions? And The CONNECT stands for Combining Old and New Knowledge to Enable Conscious Transformations to Sustainability. And conscious transformations to sustainability is different than the type of transformations that we're going to get regardless if we do nothing. And bringing together new knowledge, new ways of thinking about it, but also recognizing that we have so much knowledge. There's so much going on around the world. There's so much indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, community knowledge, embodied knowledge that people have. That how do we actually connect all of these? And so, looking at if we start to think of adaptation as transformation, as adaptation at the species level, like are we going to survive? Yes, we're going to have to transform. Then we start to see that what is that role of creativity, of collaboration? How do we empower people to actually be system shifters and systems changers? And to what is the role of flexibility? And I don't mean just like being able to do yoga and gymnastics, but flexibility of your mindsets, flexibility of beliefs, flexibility of paradigms, being able to tell a different story about climate change and be able to put ourselves not just as like the problems, but as the solutions, the protagonists. And so the research that we're doing, Art Connects, is looking at the science-art interface. How do we kind of get out of just talking about this in our heads and really use that creativity, and not just to talk about climate change in a different way, but to really bring together, a different ways of knowing, connect the left and right sides of the brain, and really, communicate different potentials in that. The Coffee Connects project is looking at coffee production and the whole global value chain, and how do we see that value chain as being alive and about relationships. So the farmers in Burundi, where one student is studying, and the farmers in Guatemala, how do we link them to the barista in Oslo or the Costco in North America? And how do you make those connections so that you empower the farmers to actually change their land use? And sometimes, both of them are using photo voice, and sometimes just getting people to see the problem in a different way and the solutions in a different way is very empowering. With Education Connects, we're looking at not just, how do we transform the way that we are really telling the story about climate change to students? Because you can really, you can kind of devastate people by going in and, and scientists know this too, if I stop this talk earlier about okay, this is just, the way the world is, then you might never get people coming back. It's I think I'll go to art history or something. But to empower young people to see that, to become systems changers, to become very critical of the way what's taken to be as a given, and to be able to see their role in shifting society rather than just kind of going along with the given. And finally, Travel Connects is really looking at not just the travel industry in the Arctic and Antarctic and how that's affecting people's sense of urgency about the problem, but also how stories travel, narratives travel. Because what we see with people who are experiencing those things is everybody has, there's an emotional moment that can be life-changing, but it could also go whoosh right by. And so how do you use our stories from traveling to actually shift people and systems? So together, and what I'm going to talk about after the break is really how do we then engage with social change and nonlinear social change, where we suddenly recognize that the individual and the collective are related, and that we actually can be, we could be this close to that tipping point where suddenly everyone goes wow, we burned fossil fuels to go from point A to point B, or we ate meat 7 days a week, 3 times a day, or we, all those things that we take for a given, what we might look back in 100 years and go wow, what were we thinking back then? And so where, I think Hilda, you were the only one that raised your hand that it's possible for, the 12 years and everything. And it's almost embarrassing to raise your hands who are you? What are you, naive? But that possibility, of those social tipping points, of it happening very rapidly, and that it takes, each person, it takes a change in those social norms. And I have to admit that this is the first time I took the train to Trondheim, because it's okay, take the train. And it was really nice, it was a nice thing. I'm still wobbling because I feel like I'm seasick, but it's that those norms are changing this. And when you start to change social norms, when you start to change culture, when you start to change politics, when you start to change power, you start to see that things can change really fast. And I think that that's what we're looking for, not whether we can do it, but how do we do it? And how do we do it, again, equitably and ethically? So when we come back, I'm going to go into these three, look how we identify technical versus adaptive problems in the three spheres of transformation, and why I think we have to actually take a different approach to social change. You know, from that first half of talking about like the magnitude of the change and the things that need to, you know, like how close we might be to these environmental tipping points that would be disastrous for people and the planet, you know, the question is like, how do we activate social tipping points? How do we collectively transform at this rate, scale, speed, and depth that is called for? And so this means that, you know, we have to actually start to look differently at the problem. And, you know, we have people on the streets, act now before it's too late. But how do we act? What do we do? You know, how should we be at this time in global history? And again, the challenge is, you know, we're like, we're really trying to struggle to change the world. You know, it's like, I want to change the world and that kind of thing. And it's not just climate change, you know, it's land use change, it's biodiversity loss, it's ozone depletion, it's atmospheric aerosol loading. And scientists once told me, like, no, climate change isn't the biggest issue, the nitrogen problem. If we can solve that, we can solve anything. And so, you know, so there are many chemical pollution, ocean acidification, all of these issues. I mentioned the nitrogen cycle. And also social issues. And this is, you know, Kate Raworth's like donut framework of, you know, like social equity, gender equality, health, food, water, income, education, resilience, voice, all of these, you know, we need to actually do this in a way that creates a better society for everyone. So how do we do it? Is it, you know, are these like, what are the leverage points for working on this? And you're not going to find the answers to these in the 1.5 degrees Celsius report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You're not going to find it in the climate change literature, but you will find it in the social science literature, within the humanities, within, you know, every other field is actually looking at change. And, you know, much of our research is about, you know, how do we understand change? What are our models of causality? And so the books that have inspired me to, you know, actually think differently don't necessarily have climate change in the title, but it's really on trying to understand, you know, what is our immunity to change? What are those moments that actually shift people? How do we deal with power and politics and, you know, envision real utopias in a what is, you know, currently capitalist system, et cetera. And one book that like popped off the shelf, because you can tell what books I like, you know, Tools and Tactics for Changing Your Organization and the World, the Practice of Adaptive Leadership. So I was like, adaptation, change the world, I'll get that. And what these authors from the Harvard Business School, and this is very much for business audiences, they distinguish between two different types of approaches to problems. And the first one is technical. And these technical problems can be diagnosed and solved by applying or improving established knowledge, know-how, and expertise. So we do like more research, better management, investments in, you know, like the expert knowledge. So, and technical problems, you know, can be used to like design batteries that last longer, to, you know, have, you know, solar panels on roofs. You know, there's a lot of things that are actually quite technical, and we tend to be quite good at them, you know, like in general, like, okay, we can figure out how to increase the you know, distance of an electric car, et cetera. But there are also what they call adaptive problems. And these adaptive problems are really about mindsets, because they draw attention to beliefs, values, worldviews, not just the individual ones, but the shared ones, the ones that we might operate in within a university, an organization, a family, a society, or whatever. And so when I started reading this book, I was like, wow, climate change is an adaptive challenge. You know, it's not that and I mentioned earlier that, you know, this IPCC says we have the technologies we need, but we're not employing them anywhere near the rate and the scale and the speed that we need to be doing right now. So it's like that. This, you know, these are, yes, we might be doing the technology, but often, like if we're increasing the efficiency of a jet engine, it just means you pay like 450 kroner to fly to Los Angeles or something. That there's, you know, these paradoxes that step in economically, and so it's really about like what types of changes can we make, and so. you know, right now, technically, we're just trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, giving everyone the carbon calculators and kind of saying, like, reduce your carbon footprint, which is absolutely important. But at the same time that we're trying to reduce our carbon footprints and, you know, be really good about, like, you know, not using plastic and doing, you know, taking the trains and things, we realize that, you know, wow, at the same time, you have these policies that are still investing in fossil fuels, in coal, in oil and gas, and everything. And that you have the banking system that is, you know, really supporting the same old investment, a financial system that continues to be tied to the price of oil and gas and minerals and things. And we see that, you know, just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. So whereas we can be working at these levels of the very individual footprint, we often forget that, like, wow, this is a problem that is also about the politics, it's about the power, it's about systems and structures, et cetera. And when we start to just take it as this, you know, technical problem, and we start to use our models, our integrated assessment models, we kind of plug in the economic trends, the emissions trends, the population trends, and this article was in The Guardian in 2017, and it says the planet has just a 5% chance of reaching the Paris climate goal, the study says. And if you go on, it says we have a 1% chance of meeting the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And if I were a planner in London, I would just start talking to my, you know, the people I work with and say, oh, we better plan for that 4-degree warmer world, you know, or I'm going to start buying some upland property. And you start to actually bet on that 4-degree warmer world or 3-degree warmer world. And you start to say, like, oh, there's absolutely, you know, science says there's actually little hope of that 5-degree, you know, like a 1.5 or 2-degree warmer world. And so, you know, so that actually creates a discourse in society, an idea that, like, oh, we can't do this. And so you'll get that there's very few people who actually think that we can minimize warming. But if you actually, as a researcher, go into the article that they're citing, and you get to the very end of the article where they describe some of the assumptions in the model, they say our forecasting model does not explicitly incorporate future legislation that could change future emissions. It is based on past emissions. So basically, you're dragging the past into the future, and then you're saying there's no chance of change. They say we've also not accounted for the possibility that decreasing prices for alternative energy could cause a sudden massive shift to alternative energy. This would be speculative. So, you know, we're not speculating on anything here, but what's not included in these models are people, you all. You know, Greta Thunberg, young people, my children, you know, people who, it's not really looking at society and culture and how social change actually happens. It's not really taking into account changes in worldviews, changes in, you know, whose values count, what we value, what we prioritize, and everything. It's almost assuming that we are, you know, that we actually don't have any free choice or any reflexivity, that we are not becoming self-aware, that we are changing Earth system processes. So it's almost like saying, oh yes, you are in the Anthropocene, but we're not actually aware that we are changing the system. And when you recognize that you are part of the system, that awareness actually changes the system itself. You know, so we are part of a system that we are changing. So that has me just kind of thinking, like, wow, this is not a technical problem, and it's actually quite dangerous because there's Jem Bendell wrote an article called Deep Adaptation, a map for navigating climate tragedy. And this is just he put it on the internet, and I think it's gotten like over 500,000 views by now. Everything. And in it, he says, he's working with climate change, and he's kind of said, currently I have chosen to interpret the information, the science information, as indicating inevitable collapse, probable catastrophe, and possible extinction. There's a growing community of people who conclude that we face inevitable human extinction and treat that view as a prerequisite for meaningful discussions about the implications for our lives right now. So there's a lot of people who are kind of saying, like, and what he's saying, if you read his article, it's kind of like trying to get that conversation to that extreme, like, wow, we are at an existential threat and crisis. But many people are going like Jonathan Franzen, an author, saying, like, you're deluding yourselves if you think we're not going extinct in the next 20, 30, 40 years. And there's a lot of people who are just saying, you know, game over. we're giving up on this. And so that is like a type of, like when I talk about deep adaptation, I talk about adapting deeply to the idea that there is possibility and potentiality out there. And what we end up when we just focus on adaptation is these very technical solutions to lift, build the seawalls, lift people up, and, like kind of adapting to a risk that we ourselves are creating right now, rather than adapting to the idea that we can change the change or change the risk. So there's a really important distinction here between these technical and adaptive problems. And if we address adaptive challenges as if they're only a technical problem, it will lead to failure. This is like the deck chairs on the Titanic, and we paint them green, we pat ourselves on the back, and we say, oh, we are changing, the green shift is underway. We have not changed direction. We have not even thought about like just changing the whole model of the way we're moving the ship in general. And so technical problems, if we treat it as a technical problem and it's not a technical problem, we will fail. And I think that's what we're witnessing right now, is that, like that the technical approach isn't getting us where we need to go. And I started in 1988 with that picture and the emissions curves. And at some point we have to realize that this problem goes much deeper than just technical. So to identify adaptive challenges, how do we know here in Norway that this is more than just a technical problem? The authors of that adaptive leadership book say that it often is when there's a huge gap between your ambitions and your reality. And we see that with like the 1.5 degree goal, the 2 degree goal of the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. And that we see also that we're reading constantly that environmental records are just being shattered over and over. And we're actually seeing climate change play out in front of our eyes. And going back to like, what was I thinking in 1988 when I first started learning about climate change and working on like the research with the general circulation models and food security, I thought that like, oh, when I'm really old in like the 2020s, we'll just be looking and trying to find, we'll start to see statistical significance. And I don't think anyone estimated that we'd actually be seeing such, feeling such impacts of, and seeing like almost like the fingerprint of climate change on that system. But you have an adaptive challenge also when an increasing sense of crisis is starting to be felt. We're starting to really see that these multiple crises interacting together. And again, it's not just climate change, but it's also about how we organize our food systems. It's about like extreme events and how we deal with those, not just before in terms of, but afterwards. And then you have like the Bahamas and Puerto Rico and things that like, oh, next hurricane and we're just leaving many people behind. This idea. We just have not even prepared for the types of crisis and in terms of disaster risk management and building resilience that we need to. But so all of these different types of crises are really pointing again to the fact that we can do much better. And finally, I just have to, a friend of my the family, he drew this when he was 16 when I was explaining to him about like how many people in Norway are viewing climate change. And it's kind of like that it will affect other people, not us. We will be the winners under climate change. 4 degrees, hooray, we can eat outside in the summer, or something like, or have a longer, summer season. And so the idea that higher temperatures, more rain, shorter snow seasons, that there will be winners and losers, it really, forgets this idea that we are connected. We are in a global economy. We are, we are, all, global citizens to some extent, because what happens with China, what happens in the Indo-Gangetic Plains, all of that will affect us overall. And if anyone was here 2 summers ago when it was really warm in parts of Norway, you realize that there are no winners in a 4-degree world or 3-degree world, and even 2 degrees. And so this raises this question, like that, we just love technical problems and we hate adaptive challenges because they do move us out of our comfort zone, our zone of equilibrium, where there's a productive range of distress where you can actually go like, problem, we need to deal with it. If you don't have that range of distress or a sense of distress, you just kind of go like, well, somebody will deal with it, it's not that important, or you treat it as a technical problem. But what we're seeing here is that, we actually have a threshold that we, tolerance where we can actually engage quite effectively. But we also have limits to tolerance, and everybody has different limits. And if people are worried about their food security or their job or their health and things, they might not be able to want to talk to Karen O'Brien about climate change and its threats for, whatever. So recognizing that and recognizing, like when I teach sometimes I just, I go on and about climate change, and then I present biodiversity loss, and then I talk about the nitrogen cycle, and then they just go like way, their tolerance has gone to their cell phones, and they don't come back and everything. And I think that, how do we communicate, how do we recognize like how to actually talk about the problem in a way that isn't just like this, oh, all will be well and utopian and this is good and optimism, with this idea that, like to that balance between showing the potential that exists right here and now to do much better. Because if there's anything we can communicate, it's that there's a huge difference between 1.5 warming and 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. There's a huge difference between half a meter of sea level rise and 2 meters or 3 meters or 4 meters. And that's the choice that the IPCC is saying, is like, we can do better. And that is, that's that deliberate thing. And so this brings us to this question of transformation. What does that mean? It's, it's often described as a physical or qualitative change in form, structure, or meaning making, or maybe that's just the definition I use, but it's really exemplified in the metamorphosis of a caterpillar to a butterfly, which goes through clearly a change in form. It also goes through a change in structure. Its cells kind of like turn into like a goopy glue, and it comes out as a butterfly. But it also then, you can imagine that the meaning making, the world that the caterpillar sees is different than the world a butterfly sees. It has different perspectives on life. And so that form, structure, and meaning making becomes really important. And that's where, trying to capture the significance of all three of those in any transformation process is, I work with a heuristic, or just a very simple figure that tries to simplify all these different social theories and multi-level perspectives and things down into three interacting spheres of transformation, which we call the practical, the political, and the personal. And in some ways, the practical really is like form, the political is structure, and the personal is meaning making, if you wanted to like just oversimplify. But the point here is that any outcome for sustainability, including the 1.5 goal or the Sustainable Development Goal, has to actually include all of these if it's to be successful. And in some cases it always does, because you're always coming from a certain place of meaning making. But where we tend to focus is right in the bullseye in that center on the practical sphere. And these are the behavior and the technical responses, because we can measure them. They're something that we can invest in them. We can see the results. We can check the boxes. They're things that then, like, everybody who is giving out any money for any projects on this wants to see results in 5 years. They want to see output and outcomes. But the real impact maybe lies in other spheres. And so, the 169 targets of the Sustainable Development Goals are mostly focused here in this very practical sphere. How do we, get more people riding bicycles, eating less meat, women's, more girls in school, more better water quality, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where, going back, we're really failing to achieve this. And again, we have a lot of potential and so many innovations and solutions, smart cities, this and that, but it's actually not shifting the curves. It's not bending. So it doesn't really rattle the system as much. And that's because, we also have these systems and structures, and what we call this is the political sphere. It's not the Norwegian, like just political, what do you vote for, but it's the way we collectively organize society. It's how we decide on how we can be together. And so when I say, like systems, it's, relationships between different parts that actually form a large whole. And structures are the social norms and rules and regulations and incentives and structures. So, our water, if we want to have water in that practical sphere, you have to think, are we going to have a public-private partnership? Are we going to make water accessible to everybody as a human right? Are we going to put a price on it? Are we going to make it free? All of those things are very much political decisions about, how are we going to organize society, our resources, how are we going to treat each other in general. And it's in this political sphere where we can get really stuck and polarized, and this is what you're seeing a lot right now, is it took like 30 years to get to, or like 25 years to get to a voluntary agreement to limit greenhouse gases in 2015, a voluntary agreement to say, like, this is an issue. And so in the United States, you see that, that there's, it's so you're green or you're not green. It's a highly polarized society. And we also see that in this political sphere, we get the social movements. We get people organizing and say, we do not take this. And again, the Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, Sunrise Movement in the US, the Green New Deal, all of these things are saying there are alternatives. There are different ways of organizing the systems and structures. But the point is that in the political sphere, we can get really stuck, and it can get really antagonistic, and it can get, you can feel like we are going like 12 steps backwards with many aspects of environmental the progress made over the decades. And often that's because we ignore the personal sphere. And when I say personal, it's not just individual, but it's individual and shared. Because it's our subjective individual and collective beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms, the way that we see the system in that political sphere, the way that what we prioritize in that practical sphere. So when we have, when our personal values are saying, we need unending economic growth as a priority, and then we're going to look for outcomes in the practical sphere that prioritize economic growth at any cost, whether it's from weapons or rebuilding, lost coastlines or whatever. If we say sustainability or a thrivable world, we're going to actually organize society in that political sphere quite differently and prioritize different types of solutions. And to recognize then that not everybody is seeing the same system, not everybody is prioritizing the same outcomes. Not in that political sphere we have multiple worldviews. We have multiple, how do you connect with people who don't see the world like you? And when I usually present this to scientists or researchers, I get people, they're just going like, yes, 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 you're absolutely right. We need to change people's beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms. That's the solution. You're right, Karen. And think about that for a moment. How many of you like to be changed by someone else, like your mother, your partner, How many like to change other people? Yeah, a few of us are like, oh yeah, but it always backfires, and people don't like to be considered objects to be changed. It's like putting them right into that practical sphere. It's like turning the political and the practical together and saying, okay, now in the practical sphere, we're not only going to work on technology, we're going to work on changing your beliefs and your values and your worldviews. And then it's like, who is the we that is doing this, and what is the issue behind it? And this became really clear to me when I was working on the fifth assessment report for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I was in the chapter on, that had transformations in it on, climate resilient pathways, adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development. And we had definition of transformation, and we just thought, we included the 3 spheres in there and we had to talk about it. And when we got to the plenary approval in Yokohama, Japan, countries like, we don't want transformation in this report at all. We don't even like that definition. Who decides on this? And so it started a week-long dialogue on the definition of transformation and whether we could actually use it in the report. And it became very political, and transformation is political because who is transforming whom and under what premises? And these countries, I won't name them, but they were like, we have been transformed before. We got your structural adjustment programs. We have your, the latest whatever programs and things. And so the definition in the summary for policymakers was actually changed to say, in the context of this report, it refers to, based on the values that apply to a particular country. So it's to say that, it's not like, and whereas we were seeing it as like, oh, we transform capitalism, we transform, all of these things. But, there is that dimension of, where transformation becomes political. So if we want to actually connect, create these transformations, we have to be aware of the personal, the political, and the practical spheres and how they intervene together. And going back to that leverage, how do we transform the world at this, to do this, a really brilliant paper by systems thinker Donella Meadows. She wrote this back in 1999. She actually, at a conference, came up with a list of the most effective ways to transform systems. And she was part of the Club of Rome, so one of the original kind of systems thinkers and modelers. And she says, we spend a lot of attention, probably 90% of our attention or effort goes into these, shifting the constant parameters and numbers, the tax rates, the subsidies, your little, like your footprints and all these things, or changing the buffers, which is really hard to, change the reservoirs or how much CO2 we can store and everything. And basically she's saying like that practical sphere, and this is my interpretation of this, the practical sphere, it doesn't have that much leverage. In fact, she argues that it's often pushing the system in the other direction by having just kind of like, reverse impacts that you haven't really considered. When you subsidize something, then suddenly everyone goes like, oh, let's go for that, or that. And she says there's a lot more leverage in looking at these feedbacks, the cycles that actually enhance or modify processes, or in the structure of information flows. If you make information transparent, suddenly you can actually see that like, oh, it's better to use, this than a plastic bottle. You start to see what's in the clothes we wear, what's in the food, what's behind things, so you can start to actually make better decisions if you know something about that information. But if you look at the higher ones, rules of the systems and the power to influence the rules of the system have a much higher impact. And we see that again, with people in power who can, change a rule overnight that actually changes emission standards, or where we're looking for oil, et cetera. And what she calls the highest leverage points, I consider the personal sphere, the goals of the system, the mindset or paradigm from which the system arises, and the power to transcend paradigms. And that last one, the power to transcend paradigms, in her paper, she's kind of like this, she recognizes that this is a really hard one, because you really have to just recognize that a paradigm is a paradigm. It's a thought pattern or beliefs, and that to be able to just kind of like recognize that all of these are our best bets on the way we think the world works, and that you can't be so tightly wedded to any one of them because they're always changing. And so this idea then that the practical, political, and personal are important, it makes me think that like, okay, maybe we need more attention to that personal sphere and how to skillfully work with that, with the political sphere and with the practical sphere. When we look at values, you can see that there are universal, values that apply to all different cultures and things with different motivations. You can have conservation as a motivating factor for values, self-enhancement, openness to change, or self-transcendence. And Shalom Schwartz came up with his structures of values, and the 9 values that apply in all cultures and are expressed differently in different cultures are, conformity and tradition and security. And certainly tradition in Norway might look very different than tradition in India or whatever. They express themselves differently in different times. Power, achievement, hedonism, stimulation, self-direction, and then this universalism and benevolence. And the idea here in looking at values is that like it's not like my values are universal. They're very context dependent. In some cases we want security, in some cases we prioritize tradition. But what we start to see, and what some studies have shown, is that you really get the value conflicts when you, the traverse, like openness to change versus conservation, or self-enhancement versus self-transcendent, that's where you often get the conflicts in that political sphere. So in many ways, when you start to see climate change as a relationship issue, you start to see it like, this is also about values. It's about what matters to us, our priorities, our interests, how do we engage with those in that sphere. So, and that brings us then also to worldviews. How do we see the world? And it's not just like, and that's a really, you can talk about the traditional worldview, the modern worldview, the postmodern worldview, the post-postmodern worldview, as the World Values Survey and studies have done. But worldviews are really influenced by so many different dimensions of ourselves. The self, who am I, what am I aware of? Our values, like what is significant or important to me? Moral development, what should I do? What's the right thing? Interpersonal, how should we interact? Human needs, what do I need? How, emotional issues, how do I feel about this? Aesthetic and arts and things, how, what's attractive to me? And relational, where am I drawing the line between us and other? Where are my boundaries in who's included in my world and who's not included in my world? And then spiritual, what is of ultimate concern? What is the meaning of life and all this? Each of this will give us a different perspective on the way we see the world, and a different vantage point, but it will also influence that we actually are seeing different worlds. We are actually making sense of worlds in very different ways, and it'll give us different lenses to approach the issue of climate change and the solutions to climate change. And every lens including our own, has blind spots, has, filters and things. And so, like, it's just, once you take out some filters, you have other filters. And so how do you work with worldviews, including your own, to actually say, like, how can I connect to people, to what they value, what matters to them at a universal level, like that, actually recognizing that, like, yeah, we all share some, basic needs and wants and interests that, come down to this very deep level. And that brings us then, to paradigms. The source of, they are what she considers the source of systems. There come the shared social agreements about the nature of reality, systems goals and information flows, feedback, stocks flows, and everything else about systems really is about the paradigm through which we approach those systems. Now, the Enlightenment paradigm, that is dominant in Western society really is a mechanistic paradigm. It's like the world as a machine, and that we can actually, like, figure out how to operate and run. It's very atomistic, that we can reduce everything down to these little parts. It's very deterministic, that we can figure, like that integrated assessment model. We can actually, model. If we get it all right, we can figure out exactly where we're going to be in 2100, and it might be that, that we can actually determine some things. But again, there's assumptions in those models that maybe are self-fulfilling when you don't do this. So it's reductionist, very materialist, like matter is this solid stuff and matter is dead. Consciousness does not really exist in this. It's just a phenomenon that comes out of your neural connections, which means then that, within debates in the philosophy of science and, history of science, that consciousness doesn't necessarily exist. It's just it's a phenomenon. When you say free choice doesn't exist, so if the future is a choice, as I said earlier, then who's deciding? Who is it that decides? Which is it going to be like the oil and gas companies? Is it going to be the experts? Is it going to, it raises this other question. But there are other paradigms out there. There have been many paradigms, or different cosmologies, different ways of seeing the world, from indigenous knowledge, from, like all through history and culture. And what Andreas Weber calls going from, like, the Enlightenment to enlivenment, where you really recognize lived experience, embodied meaning, subjectivity, consciousness, interbeing, spirituality, or what Jane Bennett calls, like, vibrant matter. Matter is alive, or actor network, like that, matter has agency. And this resonates with many of the social sciences and humanities, and becomes, like this kind of powerful way of thinking, like, yeah, there are other alternative worldviews. And I often point out that, like, the Enlightenment worldview was challenged over 100 years ago by quantum physics, and quantum mechanics forced physicists to reshape their ideas of reality at the deepest level, and to revise their concepts of position and speed, as well as their notions of cause and effect. So suddenly the world wasn't exactly what they thought it was anymore at the subatomic level, like there's like, oh my God, it's just vibrations, and it's, like there's a whole revolution that has been going on that has led to everything that we're using today, the cell phones, the lasers and computers, and the quantum revolution has been underway, and it is underway right now with quantum computing and quantum encryptonation. But it's also led to many views on, like, quantum social science, and people are using the algorithms and matrices and the math of quantum physics for social sciences. And these authors talk about it has the goal to investigate problems within the wide remit of social sciences, from economics, finance, psychology, or other domains, with the help of the formal models and concepts used in quantum physics. And I use something called Q methodology, a mixed method to get at subjective experience. And it took me years to realize the Q was for quantum, because that's when it was developed in the 1930s, to actually look at language as a quantum phenomena. And this is something that Alexander Wendt, who's an international relations systems theorist, he's been very interested in, like, if human beings really are quantum. He's looking at quantum social science. What if we were to reinvent social science today? It probably wouldn't be positivist as it dominates in economics and international relations. It would essentially be founded on a mistake, and social life will therefore require a quantum framework for its proper understanding. So he's rattling the social sciences by saying, let's look at another paradigm. And he comes from constructivism as an approach. And physicist and feminist Karen Barad has been challenging also the way that we see the world and the way we think about mattering. And she says, mattering is not a thing like this, but a doing. It's this kind of congealing of agency where we're constantly making that cut and creating the world, that coming to matter. So all of these are different ways of actually using climate change, you know, like different theories and things. And not the least, we can look at like what quantum brings in terms of new metaphors. And people working on language, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, who look at language and emotion and things, they say new metaphors have the power to create a new reality. And that this can happen when we start to comprehend and experience in terms of a metaphor, and it becomes a deeper reality when we begin to act in terms of it. So imagine acting as if we are non-locally entangled, that if when I do something here, it actually does influence the whole in some way that we certainly can understand. If we start to think of our language as something that is not fixed or given, but it is something that is relational, that happens in that mattering, we start to see that. And they say much of cultural change arises from the introduction of new metaphorical concepts and the loss of old ones. So this is kind of talking about that whether you believe that this is just like, you know, methodological implications or meaningful implications or just a metaphorical type of thing, it really does matter. And this gets into that idea of beliefs. You know, belief is an acceptance that something exists or is true, especially without proof. So it's kind of like that our best bets given everything that we know today. And one big question is, do we believe what we see or do we see what we believe? And this is, you know, constructivism versus realism. There's a reality out there and we're just trying to figure it out, or that our beliefs are actually filtering what we start to see. And this was in the paper 2 summers ago, because it got a lot of likes and forwards and clicks and attention on Facebook, because like, oh, the fatherland, most important, was saying like, you know, look at this, what do you think of this? And getting lots of comments and things. And it made international news because it was this anti-immigrant group here in Norway mistook empty bus seats for women wearing burqas. And that idea then that Oslo buses, that you can see whatever you really want to see in them, you know, becomes really important. And so we tend to find evidence to support our beliefs, and seldom do we challenge the underlying assumptions behind those beliefs. We don't necessarily look at them. And this goes for climate change too. And there's studies that show that, you know, seeing is believing, depending on what you see. You will see the same data about ice melting in Greenland, and you will put your beliefs on it. And we see that with an impeachment investigation in the United States, that what we believe actually, you know, we read the data with that. So if I say to you, we can limit climate change to 1.5 degrees, probably many of you, like as I asked earlier, is going, no, 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 no. But think for a minute what beliefs pop up in your head. Like what are the first things? Can anyone just pop one up for me? Yeah? Okay, human beings are selfish. That's a good belief, you know. And I'll go through some of the other ones that is, but that anyone else have one that just to see if I caught them all. Yeah.
This was created in the first place.
That it was created. And would you say like then it's if it okay, oh okay, yeah, okay, so if it is, yeah, so you could doubt the thing. So some of the things that might come up is like, oh, it's already too late. We should have done something in 1988 when I first started studying this, and that, you know, like that we could have done something back then. We could have avoided this, but not now. People will never change. That is that idea of, you know, my husband has not changed yet, and I've been working on it for more, you know, like, yeah, almost 30 years, and like, how do we get people to change? And they're either too stupid, they're too selfish, they're too this or that. And sometimes you have a very small sample size for that, like, because my uncle is so selfish, people will never change. You might have a very academic, the payoff for renewables will never exceed fossil fuels, or, you know, like, I've done my modeling, and this is, you know, we just won't get there because we have enough fossil fuels. Some people might just say the models say it's impossible, and the models are always right, because models are good at predicting some things. And people might say it's all just natural variability. We don't need to, you know, this is nothing. And others might just say we don't actually need to, because we can adapt to anything, because, you know, we're still here and we've been through, you know, glaciers and, you know, glaciations and, you know, lots of different periods of human history. And there might be some people that actually go, of course we can reverse global warming. And those are, you know, like, oh, Paul Hawkins' drawdown. It is like the first attempt, you know, the most comprehensive plan to reverse global warming. And I was on the scientific board, and it's like, I don't know, that's not what we're saying. Well, it's actually the only plan we have, but it is, they're measuring 100 solutions to look at, and they've modeled them to say that actually it all exists. And it's not just, educating girls, lots of, the solutions with food come into this. So just to wrap up in the last minutes, transformation really is about shifting your perspectives. Paul Hawken has a very different perspective on those solutions, and the Drawdown Project is really, really focusing on a much wider solution space, not necessarily deeper in terms of connecting with the values and worldviews and, like in that personal sphere. It's very much in that practical sphere. But instead of feeling like super overwhelmed by climate change and the state of the world, if you can actually start to look at it as an object, start to look at it, experiment with change, go like, okay, here we have this world. People are actually burning fossil fuel. You can actually start to see that there are many different dimensions and ways of approaching the issue. And some people came up during the break and it's like, people who work not on climate change but on other issues. It's so important to have transdisciplinary work to bring in all types of knowledge. And that's why, connecting old and new knowledge, bringing together what we know about this so that we can actually start to see like, here is a way of looking at the planet in a different way. And when we can actually connect with those deeper dimensions, the head, the heart, and the hands linking together, getting it out of just the cognitive and into the embodied emotional experience. And that's the role of art, that's the role of action research, is to really put our, get our hands into this and activate those change. We start to see that like, the world isn't just out there. It's like, besides the fact that like we're plastic, we're polluted water, we're all these different things right now, but the world, like that line between us humans and nature is a construction. It's something that has been created, us and the other, north and south. All of those things are just conceptual ideas that we have. And so when we start to see that we are not just individuals related to others, we start to see that, we can actually shift that thinking, when we shift our mindset, we actually are shifting with other people. So it becomes this idea that, we can actually change. And this is, I've worked in developing these three spheres with Monica Sharma, who wrote this book 2 years ago on radical transformational leadership. And she really challenges, her idea is that every single person can shift systems and structures, but you need strategy and you need it to be based on values that apply to everything or what matters to everyone, which is like equity, justice, dignity, compassion, and things that are not exclusive but inclusive. And she says if we want something we've never had, we must do something we've never done before to produce results. And that means getting out of our comfort zones, like stepping outside of like the normal, challenging the given, challenging everything that we've ever thought. But it's not about these radical changes. It's not about new ideas or different ideas. It's about doing the same thing differently. So it's about the quality of our response, not the quantity of our response. And so we don't have to wait for 99% of the people to change or even 51% of the people to change. And her idea is that transformation really is the powerful unleashing of human potential to commit, care, and affect change for a better life. So form, structure, meaning making, but it is in us to actually, how do we transform as part of this larger whole? And so this is one of my students, at one of the climate strikes, she said, imagine what we can do if 7.7 billion people truly believe their actions make a difference. And that idea that people are the most powerful solution to climate change exists really is something that, I think we are underestimating our collective capacity for change. And she put that on Instagram, that picture, and then somebody else in Germany made a sign, and then somebody made a cartoon of it, and then it spread. And that's how ideas are spreading, like if we can do that. So this idea that we actually matter more than we think because we are connected, because we are both individuals and collectives, becomes really important. And just to think about, going back to, how can we change? The time scales for change are often, technologies and behaviors, we can change those much faster than these systems and structures that need like long-term investments. And beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms, they will take centuries to change over time. But if we start to work from this holistic, all of these perspectives, we start to see that the time to do something is right now, and that you're always working in all three spheres. So you can be changing those or influencing those beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms, including your own right here and now. We can be shifting systems and cultures and changing those conversations about change right here and now, and we can be addressing the technologies and behaviors. So all of these then kind of just point to this idea that, that those shifts it's not going to take, and I've heard people say, oh, it's going to take forever to change paradigms. You've got to wait for everyone to die or something, or that, like that it's, centuries. But it really is that we only need, this one study said 10% need to shift their beliefs or opinions for change to happen. Other studies, on water says it's 15%, 24%. Some say it's 4%. There's all these different studies on this. But the idea is that small groups can make a big difference. And this is the 10% study, which was agent-based modeling, showing that, when people start to hold a strong opinion of something, and this, you could be an opinion for positive or negative, and that's why values are important, because not every, we don't want people to hold, you can hold the extinction narrative too. But this idea that there are these tipping points when suddenly it just becomes normal because we are connected through language, through meaning making, through consciousness, whatever. And that instead of treating us just like marbles, we can treat ourselves like that, like we are, like in metaphorically the particles and the wave functions, that we can actually, be very much, aligned with, like we matter so much more than we think because we influence systems. We are part of that larger solution. Rather than going into these, just treating like a fragmented approach and partial approach, if we actually start to work with patterns and relationships of change, like fractals, as we see in nature, in geometry, in algebra, we start to see wow, we can actually change systems at every level instantaneously. And that's Monica Sharma's approach, is really to be working here and now to create these fractals of change. And I, in my little quantum things, there's a study that shows, there are quantum fractals that are connected, entangled, with each other at all scales down to the subatomic. And so if we can actually be those fractals of change non-locally, because we are part of this larger whole, we'll actually start to see that change happen. And so that's why, just in this 90-minute talk, just to try to get you to see how you can shift relationships to climate change to actually shift the systems and the structures, then I think we will surprise ourselves by actually activating that social change. So thank you for your patience, and thanks for inviting me.